everyone, welcome to another episode of the Oriire podcast, the podcast that tells African stories. I'm Halima.
And I'm Ceci, and today we are going to have a very special episode with two very special guests. We're here with Bryan and Seyram of the Africa's Untold Stories podcast to talk about ancient African cities. Hi, Bryan and Seyram. Thanks so much for coming. Do you guys want to introduce yourselves a little bit before we move on?
Yeah, hi, my name is Bryan, and I am with Seyram. I don't know what else to say. Oh wait, and we are the co-host of Africa's Untold Stories podcast as well that discusses African history and folklore, mythology as well, which is pretty much the same thing.
Mm-hmm.
Anyway, yes, so nice to be on this podcast, first time ever, actually doing a cross podcast thingy. So thank you for having us.
Akwaba, you guys, everyone there, Ghanaians, and as you all know, I'm very fluent in Chui. So
Yes.
Yeah, but neither of us speak Twi though.
well, I speak Chui. Oh, that's interesting. What languages do you guys speak? Just let our listeners know.
I speak Frafra and Seyram speaks Ebe.
Nice.
Yep.
Nice.
Okay, so that's great. I'm sure our listeners are very happy to have you on this. Why don't you guys start by telling us a little bit about the topic we're discussing today?
Okay, so as mentioned before by Ceci, we're going to be discussing African cities. And but before we kick things off, I want to start with a brief question. So I'm just going to ask a question and I want to know the answer, what you think about it. I'm going to read a quote written by Portuguese in the 1600s. And I want you to tell me, I'll give you three different cities and you tell me which of them this Portuguese was referring to, right? Okay, so the quote is as follows. The city has 30 quite straight avenues. Each is about 120 feet wide. The houses are washed and polished until they gleam so that they shine as a mirror. That's the quote. So end quote. Now, this is 1600s. So the country where this belongs to is A, the United Kingdom, B, Nigeria, and C, the US of A.
Nigeria.
Which do you think it is?
I'm going to guess it's Nigeria. And I mean,
Nigeria.
because this is an episode about ancient African cities.
Exactly.
So
You made it so easy.
Yeah, I know, right? But then, yes, that's the point. Typically, when people hear something like that, they wouldn't think African cities. And to be fair, even in this modern day, you wouldn't think African city when you hear something like that. But yes, that is an actual account by Portuguese traders. So the topic we're discussing, the ancient African cities, is a very fascinating one because it's a very confusing one as well. First of all, cities. We just want to talk about cities, what they are. And there is no strict definition for what a city is really. But in the broadest way possible, I guess you can call it settlement that has a lot of people, a crap ton of people, and has certain features like public gathering spaces and in some cases places of worship as well. Now, one very funny thing about how cities are viewed is that there is no strict definition. So when Europeans arrived in Africa, some places they go to, they don't see certain things that other cities they saw around the world have. Like there's no major temple in the city. Like in Lisbon, you have a cathedral. Paris, you have a cathedral. You come to Nigerian cities, and there's nothing of that sort over there. There's no major center of worship in some of them. So initially, in their mind, these are not really cities. They're just places where people live, I guess.
Settlement.
Yes, settlements. But no, the definition of a city is very flexible in that sense. And so it also fed this whole misconception that Africans were not particularly complex people. And interestingly, white people didn't always have that thinking, not when they initially met. The Africans, at least not all of them had that kind of thinking, as evidenced by the quote that I read at the beginning. It's later on when, they validated placing themselves on top of the other people they had met that a lot of these misconceptions were really fed very strongly. But yeah, so there's a reason we know so little about African cities, and then it has partially to do with the fact that there's little research done about African cities, and that's because, for one thing, there are a lot of things that were built by our ancestors on the continent that are still not standing today. Primarily because we didn't build with stones in a lot of areas. In a lot of areas, we use mud bricks, and those die over time. So they collapse after a while if you do not maintain them, if you don't do the proper maintenance on them. I don't know if you've ever seen, there is this really tall mosque in Mali, modern day Mali, the city of Djenne. And every year they have this communal replastering of the mosque that they do. It's built with mud bricks, and it was built, I think, in the 1700s or so, 1700s. And every year they replaster the mosque, because if you don't do it over time, the building would eventually break down. So that's one of the problems with historical African sites, that they break down and can leave absolutely no trace behind. And also, we have this thing where a lot of African leaders don't really care about African history. So there's not lots of investment put into figuring those things and preserving even the structures that do last a while. For example, in Nigeria, in Benin City in Nigeria, the walls of the ancient city of Benin, I actually saw pictures where some of them were, broken down for real estate development with no, regard for the historical value whatsoever. So all of these things contribute to those kind of problems. I just want to say, guys, if you do have a question as we go along, feel free to pop up at any point.
Yeah, we are not
Don't
used to
really want to
monologuing
do a
this much.
monologue.
I'm
Yeah.
really enjoying this monologue. I have to say that was a fantastic introduction. You reeled us in with the question, had us answer, and then it was a really good, it was very well paced. Well done. You should continue, because I was having fun listening.
All right then. Okay. So we'll talk about a few African cities. There are a lot that we know for sure that to have existed on the continent. East, north, south, west. Oh, a running theme of Africa's untold stories is that we usually pretend Egypt does not exist,
Yeah,
because so many
because
people know.
people know a lot about Egypt already, so there's no point. We are telling untold
Yeah,
stories. Egypt has been told too many times.
I actually
exactly.
agree with you so much. And one of the principles of Oriire is that we avoid hotepery. This is like the way every time there's a new person on the Oriire team, I always say, like, look, we want to avoid hotepery on this platform. I don't know if you guys know what like hoteps or hotepery
yes.
means. Yeah, so that's a concept that we want to avoid as much as possible.
Okay, glad we are on the
Great,
same
good to
page.
know. Yeah. So anyway, there are a bunch of cities that have existed throughout Africa at different points in time. So outside of the ones like the Egyptian ones, like Cairo and Luxor, we have others in North Africa, like Fez and obviously Casablanca. There was Tripoli in Egypt, sorry, in Libya. There is Tunisia, which formerly Carthage. But then the more interesting ones, with the ones that we'd actually talk about, come from places like Mali, which had Timbuktu, Djenne, Gao. Guinea had this city, Niani, which was the capital of the Mali Empire. It's not one of the cities we'll talk about, but just to give a slight nod to Niani, it was actually a city that was said to have, it was the capital of the Mali Empire, right? So being the capital, it's the place where a lot of diplomats and people who want to actually mingle with the royals would move to. So the Mali Empire actually had different quarters for the natives and for the foreigners who came in there. So there was like a section for the Amazigh and then Arab, traders that entered the Mali Empire. So it was a planned out city with different compartmentalizations. There's also Loropeni, which is in modern day Burkina Faso. Then we have the more popular one, the city of Benin, and there's in city of Benin, which was in modern day Nigeria, not the country Benin, which took the name Benin from the city Benin. So let's not mix that. There's also the city of it's long. The city of Ingerzagamo. Ingerzagamo, yes. In northern Nigeria, I think right now it's probably somewhere around Borno State. There's also Zaria in northern Nigeria, another interesting city. There is Mbanza, Congo, which was in modern day Congo DR specifically. There is Madzimbabwe, I think I mentioned already, modern day Zimbabwe. There is the city of Aksum, which modern day Ethiopia. There is a city of Meroe in modern day Sudan as well. There is this, I can't say the city of Kami. I don't really think they term it that way, but then Kami also exists in modern day Zimbabwe as well. So there's a stone settlement. There's also Walata. Okay, so you see, you get the point. I can go on for a while.
There's a lot of cities.
We
Yes.
definitely get the point. Yeah.
Yes. No, we have to
Right.
state it because people don't imagine there were that many cities in like pre-colonial Africa. Sadly.
Exactly. And one thing you should note too is the cities range in population from a few thousand to tens of thousands for the different cities, and they had different points in time when they were relevant as well. Okay, so we're going to split the cities. Since I've been talking for a while, I will let Seyram take the lead with the cities he's going to discuss, and then I'll jump in back again later.
Okay.
So far, you're on the floor.
All right. So we'll start with Madzimbabwe or Great Zimbabwe, right? Which is in modern day Zimbabwe. That wasn't so hard to figure out, right? Okay, so we'll jump into it. So this, if we are being specific, it was near modern day Masvingo in Zimbabwe, which is around the southeastern side. And it's one of the few cities, or one of the cities we are going to talk about that had like the actual stone, they built with stone. So we have ruins that still exist now that we can go and see. So that's one unique thing about them. This city actually, or the ruins of this city, is currently the second largest archaeological site in Africa. It's like second only to the pyramids of Giza. Yet I don't know how many people actually know about this, or outside of Zimbabwe at least, which is very strange, right? Everybody knows about the pyramids of Giza. Not too many people know about Great Zimbabwe, right? So we'll just jump straight into it. Okay, so to give a bit of a history, right? This place or this city, well, according to history, it's been inhabited from like the 12th century, so somewhere in the 1100s. We are not sure exactly when, but in the 1100s, that's when it was built and inhabited. And it was built by the Shona people, who are Bantu-speaking people. They belong to the Bantu family, the language family.
Bantu language family.
Bantu language family, exactly. And so the Shona built this city, and it's one of the things that stands out about it, like I said, is that it had large stone walls that covered the entirety of the city. These stone walls were massive. You should see some of the images of the sites that exist right now. It's actually very impressive. And the engineering behind these stone walls, especially, is what makes it very interesting, because they were built without mortar to hold them together. The rocks that have been placed on top of each other, they were built without mortar. So the way they got them to be split into the individual pieces that make up the entire wall, very fascinating. And some of these walls stood up to about, what, 10 meters tall in some places. It was actually
Yeah.
pretty interesting to see. Yeah. So well, let's just go straight into it. So it was because of where it's situated, right? The city of Zimbabwe or Great Zimbabwe. It was situated right where it sort of controlled the trade between Southern Africa and the rest of Eastern Africa above it. So it
Eastern
was,
coast.
yeah, the Eastern coast. It was a major trade center or trade hub. So it was a very influential and rich city as well. And this city also, in the ruins of it, we see that they had trade routes, or they had trade with countries as far out as China. Like there were porcelains and ceramics from China that were found in the city. There were things from like the Middle East that were found in the city, which shows that they actually had an extended trade network that spanned beyond the region or the African coast. It spanned outside of Africa. They had contacts with people even before, well, the Brits arrived and pretended that we were cut off from the rest of the world, right? So I would give a brief description of what the city looked like as well. So, like I said, it was surrounded by stones. It was split into a couple sections. So there was a hill complex which sat atop the steepest hill in the city. It was surrounded by its own stones as well. It's where the king was purported to have lived, and also where there was like a religious center of sorts. So if you see it, that part is the archaeologists think it's the oldest part of the city. That it was actually one of the first parts of the city that was built. And like I said, the king also lived there. So it was pretty grand and it looked very good. Then there was a valley complex which sat below that section, right? So that's where the common folk lived. So the king sat atop a hill looking down, not in a terrible way, looking down on his subjects in a sense, right? And then opposite or on the other side of that sat the great enclosure where the rest of the royal family lived. And that one had that one had, sorry, walls that were about 32 feet high for our imperial friends, which is close to 10 meters tall as well. And they had a second set of walls so there was like one set of walls that enclosed the outside, a second set of walls that enclosed it on the inside. And it was thought to be either a royal settlement or the residence for the royal family, or it was thought to store grains for the entire city. If you ask me, I think it was kind of a bit of both, because if you look at some of the things that were excavated from those sites, you could see that the royals ate very, very differently from the common folk. So it would make sense that a good number of the food is stored around where the royals live. Yes. And like I said, the valley region is where the common folk sat. So that house close to, I think it was over 10,000 people in
Yeah,
its,
yeah. At its
yeah, that
peak,
house
10,000
over
people.
10,000 people in its peak. Like we are talking a very massive city that was like fascinating. And it started to decline shortly. Like I said, it was established in the 1100s, but it started to decline shortly after shifting trade routes and overuse of the land and stuff like that started to cause the land to become less and less sustainable for the people. So sadly, that city declined. The king left it because, oh, I forgot to mention, it was part of an actual kingdom or empire, Zimbabwe as well. So although the king lived there and it was sort of the capital, when it started to dwindle, he basically just up and moved to another side. And then well, he has a kingdom to run. He can't be brought down by just one city, right? So he had a kingdom to run. He up and moved, and shortly after the people followed. And that's how it declined. But then thankfully, because like I said, because it was built with a lot of stone, there are ruins that exist right now for us to see that such a city existed. So one interesting thing about this city is also that when the European settlers that came later arrived and they saw the city or they saw the ruins of it, they saw what was left of it, they could not imagine that it was built by Africans, like Black Africans. They came up with all sorts of funny theories to disprove that there was African involvement in building that city. They had theories that suggested that what Arab settlers came, built the cities, and then up and left. They had theories that there was even a theory about the Queen of Sheba building the city and leaving. Like basically anything that would make it not be that it was built by Africans, because that doesn't fit into their narrative. We were supposed to be a backward thinking people, not capable of engineering cities that had, oh, like I forgot to even mention, cities that had like proper drainage systems and proper irrigation sites to support their agriculture. They did not believe that we were capable of building cities like that. So they had very funny theories to disprove that. But thankfully, it has been brought back to, or the truth has finally come out that we're actually responsible for building stuff like that. But yeah, enough about that. I think I'll just move on to the next one. So the
Before
second
you move
city I'll
on
be
to the next
discussing.
one, before we move on to the next one, Seyram, I just think it's interesting how, like, you know how, like, modern day, right, cities are typically regarded as where politicians and like government leaders, government institutions and everything, that's where they are, right? And then it's
Mhm.
just interesting to see how like ancient cities too is basically the same thing. For example, when the king saw that the city was not flourishing anymore, he moved and people moved with him. So I
Mm.
imagine like wherever the king moved to, that place would have been built into a city, right? Do we have information of where like the where the king moved to? Like, and did that place also become a city? Because the
No,
way it seems, it feels like cities are built, right? So I imagine like it keeps moving. So did it move to
oh,
someplace else in Zimbabwe?
I don't have that
So
information,
Mm-hmm.
really. I think
I
maybe
can answer
Brian.
that one.
Yeah.
Okay. Mm-hmm.
So when the king did move,
Mm-hmm.
around that point, the kingdom of Zimbabwe in itself was in decline. So
Hmm.
where he moved northwards, but that place did not become a sort of second Great Zimbabwe in any sense of it. Because at that point in time, the kingdom was already in decline. So although the king moved there, the kingdom didn't really last much longer after he moved. So it wasn't really a replica of the greatness that the Great Zimbabwe itself once had.
Yeah.
Interesting. And was it just because of the trade routes? Was there like some sort of war happening? Do we know
No.
that?
So
Mm-hmm.
it was a mixture of stuff. The trade route, the
Mm-hmm.
shifting trade routes was one. There was also
Mm-hmm.
the overpopulation,
Mm-hmm.
which
Yeah.
also led to overgrazing. So the land was no longer fertile, and a good number of people in the city were farmers and, craftsmen and the likes. So
Hmm.
if the city is not able to sustain itself with its food, then there comes a problem when everyone needs to find another way.
Oh,
Yeah.
that's so interesting. Okay.
Exactly.
I like the question Halima's theory raises, like from a historical perspective. So are cities based on like political leaders? So is it that the city springs up wherever the political leaders are? Or is it that the political leaders are just formed wherever the city is? What do you think is the answer to that?
I would say it's a mixture of both.
Yeah. It's a mixture of both
Because
for sure.
in many examples, when a city is actually formed, it's formed because the location is a viable location. You realize a lot of major cities in the past and even right now, they are built on locations that have water bodies running through them.
Mm.
There is Lagos, there is modern day Lagos, and then there's London, for example, Paris. They all have major waterways going through them, which is a theme because cities have to be able to sustain themselves, and you need water
Yeah.
and food to do that. So in many instances, that's what leads to the creation of the
A
cities because
city.
it's
Yeah.
viable. Yes, and then the leaders arise out of said cities. But
Hmm.
also in some instances, the leader is, or let me say, the leaders are the reason that the city is created. Because, for example, I think I mentioned Damn, the one, sorry, I don't know if you guys allowed that on your podcast.
Yeah.
Um, the one in modern day Borno State, Nigeria, Ingenzagamu, yes. And
hmm
yes, that was of the capital of the kingdom of the Borno Empire, right? But Borno Empire had two capital cities because they used to have a different one, but then the king had to move the location because he wanted a more fortified location to live with his army and all of those kind of things. So he moved to a new city, and that became the new capital. So in that sense, the king actually did was the reason that the kingdom's center moved to another location.
Mm,
So it can be both ways. It can be because of the city and it can be because of the
because of
individual as well.
yeah. At least in the case for Great Zimbabwe, I know that site was chosen because it had a more forgiving climate and it was free of what checha flies that used to terrorize the people. So they settled there because it was like prime location. It just happened to be a very interesting, like a very good place for trade and everything too. So both theories are actually supported by literature.
Yes. So we talked about the city in Zimbabwe now. Can you discuss some other ancient
Yes,
African
so
cities?
yep, great. So I'm going to take us upstairs or upwards, up north, no, not north, but like east. So we are going to Aksum now, which is in
Above
modern,
Zimbabwe.
is it? Yes, above Zimbabwe, basically, perspective. So we are going to modern day Ethiopia, where the kingdom of Aksum or the empire of Aksum was. And we're going to be discussing the city of Aksum, the same name, right? So like I said, it's in modern day Ethiopia, or was in modern day Ethiopia in the Tigray region, and has been in existence since the first century AD. So, and existed for quite a long time. So, I just jump straight into it. So, this one also had buildings that were made of stone and mud bricks, which is why we have some of the archaeological remnants still there for us to see. One of the famous ones is probably the Stela of King Ezana, who was one of the rulers of Aksum. And Aksum is also interesting because it was one of the first states to declare itself Christian. So I think it was maybe third or fourth to accept Christianity as its
Yeah, I think it was
national
that.
third, yeah, as its state religion. So it's which played a very important part in their history, but we will save that for later. We actually have more information of that on our podcast. We did a whole episode on that, and we barely even covered anything. Like Axum is there's too much information to cover. But then coming back to the city, so like I said, it's built with stone and mud brick walls. It had a population of close to 20,000 or over in its prime. And like I said, the archaeological sites have these large stone structures, these monoliths, these obelisks that have recorded accounts of some of the things that the kings did. So like I made mention of the Stela of King Ezana, who is one of the rulers of Aksum, and also the ruler under which Aksum formally became Christian, because he became Christian. Right. Good. So these stone obelisks, some of them stand about 23 meters tall, about 30. The tallest one apparently was about 33 meters tall, but then it got destroyed, sadly. So um but yeah, let's just going on. It's also because it was Christian, the city was believed to house the Ark of the Covenant at some point. I don't know if you're Christian, but if you've read your Bible, you probably would have seen Ethiopia appear a bunch of times in some verses. And
It's actually still they still believe it's in there. The
yeah,
the
they still
Ethiopian
believe
Orthodox
the Ark of the
priests still
Covenant
believe
is
it's in
still,
there. There is a
yes.
special I've forgotten the name of the church, but there's a particular church that they have a room where no one is
Yeah,
allowed to go
nobody's
in
allowed in.
except the
Yeah.
high priest, yeah, of the church, because he is believed he's the only one who is allowed to see the Ark of the Covenant.
Hmm, exactly. They have a very interesting Orthodox Christian practice that precedes the form of Christianity that the rest of us got introduced to with the arrival of the European visitors later. Right. And they also had one other interesting thing about Aksum is that they also had their own writing systems. Like I said, these monoliths have records of some of the accounts of the king and what happened during their reign, which is how we know a bunch of the stuff that went on in that time. So they had a writing system known as GS, which is also actually currently being used, right, by the Orthodox Church in Ethiopia right now.
It's being used by Ethiopia. It's like their main writing system.
Oh, it's even being used, yes. So
Yeah.
very, very very interesting,
We did a
long-standing
recent
history.
episode on this, Sarah.
Yes, I know. Yeah. So yeah, actually we did an episode that covered just the writing systems alone. So I'll leave that for Brian to get mad about. But then I'm back to the city. So it lasted from the first century AD to about the 13th. Oh, actually, let me talk about the location. So Aksum was also situated very nicely. It was built on what do they call those things? Like on top of a mountain, like a very good location. So it was pretty fortified. It was very hard to surprise them with an attack in a sense. And because of its location, because of where Ethiopia is, it was between Ethiopia and Eritrea, because of where Ethiopia is, a controlled trade between Western Africa going into the Mediterranean and the Arabian side of things, and also trade from the north into Europe. So it was a very rich city, very fortified, very, very powerful in its time of existence. And I think if I keep rambling on, this episode will stretch longer than it's supposed to. So I would stop here and let Brian take over and talk about some other cities, unless you have questions.
No,
None?
I just want to point out that you said trade from the north into Europe. That makes no sense. Trade from the
Oh,
north. Europe is already in the north.
that's
Trade from
no,
the
that's
north
what,
into the interior of Africa.
yes, that's what I'm asking
Yeah, you
from
flipped it.
Brian, why
I
are
just
you
wanted
so
to point that out.
mean? Why
Brian.
are you so mean? Oh
Ryan
my
is
goodness.
really, he's the strict historian here, I see.
Honestly.
Brian is really strict. Brian is like
Oh my God.
the he will mark your script right there as you deliver it. It's amazing.
Interesting. I just have a
Luckily,
quick
Yeah.
question.
we're on someone else's tip, so I'm not giving him as much trouble. So
Oh, okay.
this is
I,
me on a good day.
oh, okay, nice. Come on.
Yeah.
Anyway, my question is, you said something about Ethiopia and Eritrea, blah blah blah. But
Yeah.
at that like when Aksum was a city, were they like two separate countries?
No. So it
It
was
was one, right?
yeah, it was one. So it was a part of a larger empire, basically. It covered
Mhm.
a lot of land. It was basically one large empire. Even at some point, it stretched beyond the shores of Africa into the other side. Brian
Yeah,
is
yeah.
crazy.
So Okori is right. It was parts of modern day northern Ethiopia, and
Mhm.
then parts of modern day Eritrea formed
Yeah.
the core of the Empire of Aksum. And then they expanded across the Red Sea into the Arabian Peninsula. So part of modern day Yemen was actually
Hmm.
Mhm.
controlled by these African kings. They controlled both sides of the
Red
Red
Sea
Sea.
at that point. Yeah.
Oh, that's really cool. And
Yeah.
Aksum was a city in this empire.
Yes. It was
Yes,
the
Aksum was the
capital.
capital city.
Oh, okay, yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Oh,
Hmm.
that's so interesting.
Yeah.
Yeah, so for a lot of these ancient kingdoms, they're
Mhm.
usually for many of them, the kingdoms didn't actually have a name. So what they do is they name them immediately after the city. You see how
Yeah.
we have the Roman Empire?
Mm-hmm.
That's
Yes,
named
because the
after Rome.
city was Rome.
Yeah.
So
Mm.
it's a Roman
Oh,
Empire.
okay.
So Axum, the Axumite Empire.
Aksumite
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
Empire.
There's a theory that the name Mali actually comes from a perversion of the original name of the capital city of Nieni. So it's like there's a perversion from Nieni into Mali that ended up becoming Mali in common parlance.
Oh, that's so cool.
Yeah, so there's
Hmm.
always that thing. Anyway,
Yeah.
yes, so
Brian,
those
want to
are
take
two
over?
cities. Yes, I will take over and just quickly, since we've spent a lot of time on the other ones, I will brush through a couple of cities that are also very interesting. The first one is modern day Mali, the city of ancient Djenne or Djenne-Djenno, which is found inside the modern day city of Djenne. So it's almost like a city within a city, except the smaller city inside it is significantly smaller. Now, this city in itself is not it's not as impressive if you just pick it on its own and compare it to the other ones Seyram has mentioned. But when you look at how far back it was established and the milestones it marked for African history, then you get impressed because it was built along the Niger River in modern day Mali. I mean, the Niger River goes across a bunch of countries, including Mali. So, but this one was built in Mali, and it was built as early as 250 BC. So this is way, way back, 250
Long
BC,
back.
before Christ. There were settlements that were established over there. And by 450 AD, they had a complex urban society. And what is some of the things that are very significant about this city is the fact that, for one, it signifies, or it's one of the earliest evidence we have of long distance trade in Western Africa. So we have evidence that this city was a hub for trade from Western Africa all the way into the Sahara and beyond. So it's a proof of pre-Arab trans-Saharan trade. And one other fascinating thing about the city is that it's also an early marker for mass production of rice. So rice is a native to Western Africa as it is to some other parts of the world. But in before the city of Djenne-Djenno, we have very little evidence to suggest that rice was mass produced. So this city is the earliest place we know that rice was mass produced. And we also know that they had a city wall around it. And the homes in the cities were built on an elevated platform, so that the problem was, like I mentioned, it was built near the Niger River. And because the banks of the river could
Flood.
overflow,
Mhm.
yes, and flood, right? So the homes were built on elevated platforms, on hillocks to protect from the flood. So that way the flood doesn't actually destroy their homes. But at some point, Djenne-Djenno would become overshadowed by the city of Djenne, which was actually built close to Djenne-Djenno itself. And the city of Djenne it was like a flashpoint for during the period of the major West African empires, the Mali, Songhai, their successor states. So the city of Djenne became a very important trade center, trade and religious center. And so Djenne-Djenno began to lose its prestige and significance as to its next door neighbor, essentially. Till it got to the point where eventually Djenne-Djenno almost kind of became like a part of Djenne itself, but not really a part of it. It's like a younger brother somewhere else that was eventually discarded, so to speak. So that's the fascinating thing about that particular city, Djenne-Djenno. In itself, it wasn't that big. It fluctuated in size. Like I mentioned, there is evidence of city walls that reach up to 2 kilometers square. So we do know at least it had gotten to some point like that. Slightly bigger at its peak, but then that's what we know for sure so far. We do know that it had populations in the thousands too, so it was quite significant. And the last city that I'm going to, before I move on, any questions about Djenne-Djenno?
Could you briefly talk about the culture of that city? Because there's something about culture here. Did you already talk
Right.
about that?
No, I didn't mention that.
Yeah.
We know very little about their culture. The only thing we know for sure is that they were an animist people. So that's the
Yeah,
African
and that's
traditional
my
religion
question. What is
type.
animist? Like, what does that mean?
So the animists are usually people who believe that how do I put it? There's spirits in objects. of nature. So trees, cowries, sacred rocks, those kind of things, they're usually animist beliefs. And animals don't usually believe in one supreme god. You're not what's the word?
Monotheistic.
Monotheistic,
Yeah.
yes.
So,
So many African traditional beliefs are actually animist in
Animist.
some way.
So basically,
Yes,
idol worshippers.
yeah, that's
pretty
how we call
much.
them
If
now.
if you want to use the Abrahamic parlance,
Okay.
Yes.
idol worshippers.
Oh, that's cool.
Yeah.
All right, the next city.
Yes, we saved your country for last.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, best for last.
Nigeria.
Best for last. That makes
No,
sense.
we are avoiding all appearance of prejudice here.
No, we actually did want to talk about this city very much.
Benin City. Let's talk about it.
Yes.
Yeah. So before I do that, we actually have an entire episode on the Empire of Benin because it is quite okay. I wouldn't say it's the most impressive, but it's definitely one of the most impressive political entities to have existed in Africa as
Yeah.
a whole. And definitely in modern day Nigeria, I think I might give it to that one or the Ife of Yoruba, one of them. But so the quote I read you at the beginning was actually a quote from the city of Benin when a Portuguese trader went there, talking about how they clean their houses so much that it looks like you're staring in the mirror.
Yeah.
It existed in modern day Edo states, Nigeria, and in the modern day city of Benin, of course. The city was built around the 15th century AD, so that's the 1400s. Now, we do know that there were earlier settlements built over there, but the belief is that 15th century is when it was actually solidified, like made into a proper city, so to speak. And the Edo people have a very fascinating history linked with the Yoruba about what was his name? What's the name of that guy? I've forgotten. The belief a particular prince who came from one of the Yoruba city states moved to that
Oduduwa.
side. Oduduwa, yes, there we go. Him.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so the whole story links with him, and they have this history that goes back with kings. The current king titles the Oba, and before that they had the Ogiso. So there's this whole fascinating link. We discussed it in detail in our episode on the Benin, but Benin City was big. It went up to 6,500 kilometers square. That is massive, like very massive. I think of all the cities that we discussed in today, it is probably the largest. And we know that the city had walls. It had a lot of walls. Well, technically it was one long wall, but the way it was designed was such that the wall went around the city and then into the city. So the city had a wall going around it, but then inside the city, there are different compartments, right? The city is divided into different areas. So different areas for certain artisans, different areas for the royal family, the different areas for certain craftsmen and the likes. And one of the very fascinating things about this city was the King's Palace. The King's Palace was described by one account as being a sort of city inside the city.
Mm-hmm.
It was massive inside. It was massive, and it was like when you got to the King's Palace, it was almost as if you had entered another domain. It was like you had left the main city of Benin and entered another city of sorts because it had its own everything. It had its own gardens, it had its own buildings, everything was separated. And another one major feature of Benin City was that it had a ditch around the walls, just before the walls. So there is a building technique that was used in Nigeria in the ancient times, southern Nigeria, to build walls, and they would dig the land just in front of where they want to build the walls and use the earthen materials from that part that they dug to build the walls, thereby creating a ditch in front of the wall itself. So the city of Benin had a massive ditch around it. And inside the city of Benin, just before the king's palace, there was also another massive ditch because they had built a separate set of walls to build the king's palace. So, to separate him from the common folk. And the walls that went around and into the city of Benin were so long that they spanned up to six, well, they spanned up to 6,500 kilometers square, is where I got that figure from. But in terms of length, they were up to 16,000 kilometers long, the walls. So that is second only to the Great Wall of China in terms of sheer length. And these walls that went around the city, they entered and they almost sort of entered homes in some instances because it's like used to split certain sections into two. And the city had its own drainage system. It had an underground drainage system, and it had street lighting of its own. They had these lamps that were hung on the walls of the city, so that at night they were lit, and people could see where they were walking, walking towards in the evenings. Now, of course, as well, these people were animists in their belief, the traditional Edo belief system, and it was the capital of the Benin Empire. Also, it had the main city itself had a population that was in the tens of thousands. Couldn't get an exact figure for it, but we do know they were definitely the tens of thousands. And unfortunately, the city would meet its decline and doom at the hands of the British people, like a lot of cities and kingdoms did back then. But they were conquered during the 1800s. They entered a long period of decline, lost a lot of power and wealth, and of course, the British were controlling more and more of Nigeria. And eventually, the British found an excuse to piss them off. And there was this whole squabble, and it ended up being it wasn't really a war because it didn't last long. And they conquered Benin. They conquered the city of Benin and they took away so many artifacts. I don't know if you've ever heard of there are these things called the Benin, there's a word for them.
The bronzes.
These sculptures. Yes, of course, I forgot you're Nigerian, you do know them. The Benin bronzes. Yes, so the Benin bronzes, the reason why there are so many of them around the world is because when the British conquered the city, they looted it. And they took so many valuables out of the city, and they took lots and lots of the Benin bronzes and just took them outside the country and, started selling them and the likes. So it also happened. Also, they burnt the city down too.
Well, that's
So
really
yes.
interesting.
This
Like the ditches, the ditches you spoke about that were like surrounding not just the Benin City, blah blah blah, but also between the king and the commoners. Besides the fact that like the ditch was used for like social class separation, were there any other uses for that ditch? I just imagine like for a city and like for a place where like power like difference is obvious. Do you think those ditches were used for like some sort of protection or something? Maybe to protect the king from like wars or like fights or something? Were there any uses, or am I just thinking it?
No, you're thinking right, because walls definitely immediately you think about, well, defense, right? But the funny thing is, so the two African cities we know with massive walls, the first being Zimbabwe, we have no proof that it was definitely for protection. What a lot of people think is that it was more of a decorative thing to show power and wealth, because there was no practical defensive purpose behind it. And when you look at the city of Benin as well, it seemed to be the same case, because there is this apparent flaw in the design of the walls, where some sections of the walls are not, they have wood that went through them, not a metal gate, there were the main gates as well, where you entered into the city. But then there were sections that just seemed to have these small openings. So then the question was, why would they have these small openings that could easily be taken advantage of? But then at the same time, we do know that they were very restrictive about who they allowed into the city and how they allowed people into the city as well. So it seemed to be for protection, but then some parts of the design does not really imply protection. So unfortunately, I can't give you a definite answer to that question.
Cool. That's so interesting.
That was a good answer, though. At least it was close enough. I just want to say this has been one of the most fascinating episodes, history episodes that we've had. This was actually really, really interesting. Thank you guys very, very much. And I want to tell the listeners
Thank you for having us.
that they can hear your voices more on your podcast, which is Africa's Untold Stories. And they can also follow you on Instagram, where you are, once again, Africa's Untold Stories.
Yes.
Very easy to remember. Very easy.
And yeah, once again, thanks so much for coming. We hope that we can have actually more discussions in the future. And if you're listening, you should keep your ears out, because we also have an episode on their podcast where we Oriire girls are discussing an African mythology related topic.
Hopefully it's as interesting as this one.
Hopefully. So it may be out already, or it may come out soon after this. I'm not really sure, but just perk your ears, because you'll hear about it soon.
All right. Thanks, everyone.
Great.
Bye.
Thank you for having
Thanks,
us.
Seyram. Thanks, Bryan.
Thanks.